Good morning, everyone. Hey, this is a communication school. Let's do that again. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yeah, okay, much better. I know it's, for academics, this is like really early in the morning. So everybody should be caffeinated and so forth. But my name is Ernest Wilson, and I'm the Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. And it really is a delight to welcome each and every one of you to this really amazing event. This is a particularly important moment with a convergence of two kind of cool things. But before I say that, I want to welcome our guests and hosts from UCLA. We're delighted to see you here. The co-organizers, Dr. Denise Mann is sitting in the front row and has just done a tremendous job in working with her colleague Henry Jenkins here at the Annenberg School. This is year number 7, I think. That's pretty amazing, a record like that of high quality, taking on really important issues. At the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, this is top of mind, this issue of diversity, but not just diversity, inclusion, and empowerment and impact. I think we've reached the point where just saying diversity is insufficient. It's the other issues of empowerment, inclusion, and change, and social change that is critical. And I just want to take a couple of minutes. Henry has generously given me an hour and a half since I'm a professor to do what professors do. But I just want to make two points. And we all know these issues. I just want to kind of reinforce the work that you're already doing and maybe some of the work that you're planning to do already in this space. One is momentum. And clearly in this great brochure, which has been beautifully designed, there are references to the following question. Is this explosion of interest, is it a blip, or is it a moment of substantial change? And I think that's an empirical question, and a question of hope. We hope that this is an inflection point, and we'll see more diversity in front of the camera and behind the camera, but it's not 100% guaranteed. We've seen blips before in Hollywood and entertainment, and then it's fallen back into the status quo ante. So that's a struggle, and I know you'll be talking about that throughout the day, this very impressive list of presenters and activists and scholars. The other point is that several days ago in our other building, the new building that you'll see later on today, in our main entryway, in our forum, we had about 1,000 people who had come to watch the first and second debates. 1,000 people showed up. So we're having this conference and this conversation at a moment in our American history where some of the most important and sharp-edged issues are being raised, none more important than diversity and inclusion and empowerment and impact. And so I would simply propose that as we continue these discussions in LA and in Hollywood, we ask the ultimate question: so what? Why should Americans care? The people who are watching the debates, whether they're in red states or blue states, whether they're in North Dakota or New York, why should they care? Entertainment is cool. I like entertainment. We all like entertainment. But what's the impact of entertainment on people's views of the world, the way they view themselves, the way they view others, the way they view gender and race, and other kinds of issues of differentiation? And I think, putting on my scholarly hat for a second, that's one of the big challenges. And Henry and I have talked about this. What does it mean to young people as they're coming of age in this odd society that we have now? So there are the aesthetic issues, there are the industrial issues that are very important. How do we improve the industry? But then what impact does the industry have? And I think for those of us, whether we're as individuals, as members of groups, as members of industries, and also as American citizens or citizens from wherever we come from, that this issue of diversity and empowerment and inclusion has got to be joined to the issue of power. And as someone once said, power concedes nothing without a struggle. So welcome to the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. I really look forward to hearing what you have to say. The expertise and experience in this room over the rest of the day is truly going to be remarkable. And now I would like to welcome Henry Jenkins to the podium.
So I'm delighted to be here with Denise Mann, representing the two schools, USC and UCLA, that rarely work together. I often joke about having a Trojan-Bruin alliance, or I think Denise would have it Bruin-Trojan alliance. Right. But we are working in partnership to bring you this important conversation. And we benefit from the support of our sponsors, the Alfred Keene.
Andrew J. Keene.
No, give it to me again. I left my glasses.
Andrew J. Keene.
Andrew J. Keene Foundation, the Fusion Media Group, the Peabody Foundation, and Havas 18?
Yeah, Havas 18.
Havas 18. So throughout the day, certainly some of those people representing those organizations are here, and I hope you'll get a chance to talk to some of them and you'll learn more about their contributions. But I want to turn it over briefly to Denise to say a few opening remarks.
Great. Welcome. My name is Denise Mann. As Henry said, I'm a professor over on the other side at the Department of Film, TV, and Digital Media. And I'm the head of their producers program, which is an industry-focused graduate program, similar to your START program. So I'm going to stick to my prepared remarks so I don't end up going off on a tangent and burning up time. But so I want to point out that we're in a unique moment of crisis and transition in Hollywood as millennials, many of whom have more diverse and inclusive attitudes about the world they live in than previous generations, are becoming the key architects of the future of entertainment. Many of these millennial creators, executives, and scholars, including those present today, are advocating for a new, more diverse entertainment industry. Whereas Hollywood has spent much of the past four decades swinging for the fences to reach a so-called mass audience, we're now seeing social media and tech platforms organizing an algorithmically defined culture industry that has the capacity to target a multitude of niche audiences. The good news is that social media services like YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, and Snapchat are providing diverse creators with a forum to tell their stories. It's doing something similar, empowering fans by giving them a voice and a platform. The bad news is that the big four tech platforms, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, are primarily engineered to deliver what's popular or trending, not necessarily what's demanding and challenging. And they do this as a means to keep us happily engaged in their digital ecosystems without friction, without a desire to escape. So that's why I believe it's important for us to come together today in a day-long event like this to make sure we have a clear understanding of both our shared cultural past and our often opaque and unknowable digital present, so that we can have a hand in shaping a diverse, inclusive entertainment industry of the future. So thank you very much for attending. On behalf of Henry and I, we welcome you.
Thank you. So someone left their keys at the registration desk. Do these belong to anyone out here? Okay, there we are. Good to find the right home. Okay. All right. Sangeeta, is Stacy out there, or are we?
She'll be here in a second.
Okay.
Do you want to tell them about Twitter?
Yes. So so what did we say it was going to be? Transmedia 7, Twitter, yes. Transform Hollywood is Transform H Wood is the Twitter handle if you want to follow along with the discussion today. And I think we just said TH7 would be the hashtag for today's event. So we have something efficient, easy for you to access. Various students are going to be monitoring and tweeting out key thoughts from the session. and that will be running throughout the day, but we hope you'll also jump on board and share your thoughts throughout the day. We very much want this to be a conversation. The formats of the panels are long. It's often creates some panic for the speakers, but we have a diverse group of people who are going to be in dialogue with each other. No formal presentations, no pitches, no papers being read, pure discussion. And midway through, or roughly midway through, we open it up to the floor for your comments, questions. So you are very much part of the process here, and we want the diverse voices in this room to contribute to the conversation as we think through together the directions the entertainment industry may be going as we move deeper into the 21st century. That said, it looks like our opening speaker is here. Stacy Smith, my colleague here at the Annenberg School, it does groundbreaking work. Probably no one does better in monitoring the diversity of the entertainment industry and calling attention to the exclusions, the marginalizations, the silencing that still takes place more often than not when it comes to a range of groups that deserve to be heard in our culture today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Stacy.
It's fantastic to be here today to talk about something that we've been working on for a little over a decade here at the Annenberg School, in particular with my Media Diversity and Social Change Initiative. I don't have a lot of time this morning, but I do want to tell you a little bit about what our initiative does and then take you through a study and some findings that I think will be really germane to framing the day and thinking through issues of exclusion in Hollywood. I know inclusion is the hot topic, but often I bring the mood down and I talk about exclusion. So I want to apologize in advance for that. At the Media Diversity and Social Change Initiative here at USC Annenberg, we do a couple of different things. At the initiative, we work with lots of different research partners, but our major thrust is working with students and equipping students with the knowledge and information they need as they learn how to evaluate media content to go out into the world, particularly into entertainment, informed, and be advocates and evangelists for inclusion in the media. We do a lot of groundbreaking research, evidence-based information to help decision makers understand gender, race, ethnicity, LGBT, and disability in the media. We are also advocates working in ways to give different underserved groups voices when it comes to who's missing on screen and behind the camera in storytelling. We're also very much involved with activism and creating solutions, simple, targeted solutions to move the needle in Hollywood. So today, what I'd like to do is tell you about a big investigation that we did, or we released earlier this year, and highlight some of the major findings from that study. We did what we called the Comprehensive Annenberg Report on Diversity. And I learned a real interesting lesson by making the title of that report comprehensive. If you don't measure every group in Hollywood, it's clearly not representative of a comprehensive look. So I apologize in advance here as well that we didn't measure everyone, but we did try to take a look as closely as we could to gender, race, ethnicity, and LGBT, though I will be talking about issues of disability on screen as well. So what's our Comprehensive Annenberg Report on Diversity, or the CARD report? Well, the CARD report is really something that grew out of lots of conversations we've had over the last decade about companies and how companies, not specific shows, not particular production companies, but studios are major players in this space. How are these companies doing when it comes to inclusion on screen and behind the camera? So what we wanted to do is look at the properties, the stories, fictional content, films, television streaming stories coming out of the most popular or prominent companies in Hollywood to figure out how they're doing with who's on screen and working behind the camera. So of course the big six, not only their films but also their television shows were included in the sample, and by television shows I'm only talking about fictionalized content throughout today's presentation. But in addition to these six companies, we were also interested, of course, in fictional storytelling on the streaming platforms and digital platforms, Netflix, Amazon, and Hulu. CW is also included in the investigation, which is overseen by two different companies up on this screen. So the CARD report really seeks to answer a couple of different questions that I'll take you through in this presentation. So first off, what did we do? If we look on this slide, we analyzed 414 stories across these 9 companies. In film, we looked at all of the films that were distributed by these studios or their art house divisions in 2014. Now, if you follow the media diversity and social change work, we've already done 2015, and we're working on 2016 right now on the second floor of this building. So we've moved along, but the great thing about reporting on film is it hasn't changed in about 50 years. So you can generalize these findings, and I'm actually not kidding. So I'll get to that in a moment. We also looked at primetime. We looked at every scripted primetime fictional television show on both all of the holdings of these companies in terms of popular channels. There were 31 channels represented in the sample. And the stories had to be released between September 2014 and August 31st, 2015. Thank you so much. In addition, we looked at all shows on streaming platforms as well. So it's a pretty robust sample. At times we deviate a little, and when those deviations occur, I will let you know. So what did we do? For on-screen characters, our unit of analysis was the speaking character. Now, a character, all they have to do to be counted in one of our studies is to say one word. So this is a really low bar to be included in our investigation. And we do this purposely. We want to compare all the speaking characters on screen to population statistics. We then take a look at every speaking character and analyze their demographics, like gender, race, ethnicity, sexual preference, role in the story, their domesticity, whether they're shown as parents or relational partners, and sexualization. Now, our method here at the MDSC Initiative is probably a little different than if you were to read other studies looking at patterns of content on screen. We don't simply have one research assistant evaluate a story, put together the metrics, and enter it into the data. Rather, we have 3 unique independent evaluators assess every single show or movie. Then all disagreements are resolved through discussion, and after the discussion, that final file is quality checked by a 4th person before it enters the data. It enables us to make claims that I don't think anyone else in the world can make about what we see on screen. So I'm extraordinarily confident in the findings that I'm about to present. So let's take a look at what we've found, or a snapshot of some of the data. This report's available on our website, so please, if you're interested, take a deeper dive, because I can't possibly cover all of the information just this morning. Okay. Of the 11,306 speaking characters on screen, roughly a third were girls and women. So let's bring up the next slide. Interestingly enough, this calculates into a gender ratio of 2 males to every 1 female, and there is fluctuation by platform. Less than a third of all speaking characters, actually less than 30% of speaking characters, are girls and women in film. Now, this finding, it shouldn't surprise anyone, because if you follow the work, there's an interesting kind of pattern here that's at play. Women buy, and girls buy 50% of the tickets at the box office, and they're 50% of the population. But this number has not moved. We can track back to a small sample of films from 1946 to 1955, where 25% of female characters on screen were women in film. So this has been impervious to change and activism for over a half of a decade. We also look at how many casts are balanced. Balanced cast means 45 to 55, 54.9% of all speaking characters were female. Only 18% of all stories across the sample of movies and television shows were balanced. Movies are the least balanced, only 8% of all stories, and cable stories, cable TV shows are the most, 23% of shows. So, in film in particular, girls and women, if we compare the percentage on screen to what we see in the population, are still, of all identity groups that we have studied, they are still the most underrepresented. Besides gender, we also take a look at race and ethnicity every year in film, and for this study in television as well. About 72% of all characters are white, and the different breakdown of different groups are shown on screen. What's interesting here is that less than 30% of all characters across the sample are from underrepresented racial or ethnic groups, which is about 9 to 10% below what we would expect given the population norm. Now, these data are really important, but they mask something that's far more problematic. If you were to take a look at these data, and what I like to say is disaggregate them and look at the distribution of parts, we know that more than 20% of all of the stories in our sample, more than 20%, did not feature a single Black or African American speaking character on screen. So, the 12%, it's being pushed up because there are stories that have more, a higher density of Black or African American characters in the cast, and there are quite a few that have none. Okay? So it's important to disaggregate data. It's even more important when we move to Asian or Asian American speaking characters. More than 50% of all the stories in our sample failed to depict one Asian or Asian American on screen. So this is what I referred to as the epidemic of invisibility. There are still groups being erased from storytelling day in and day out in the industry. Okay, in addition to gender and race ethnicity, we also looked at gender identity and sexual identity. And as you can see here, about 2 to 3% of all speaking characters are LGBT identified. Most of them are male, and most of them are white, which shouldn't surprise anyone who studies these patterns closely in film or television. Now, it's interesting, I just want to highlight the one finding regarding transgender characters. Everyone talks about how much progress has been made, and I'd like to just note that 4 of the transgender characters all appeared in one show. One show. Okay? So this whole conversation that inclusion is moving forward, when we disaggregate data, it really illuminates just how far we need to go. Last year, across the top 100 films of 2015, there was only one transgender female character on screen, and she appeared for maybe 10 seconds. Now, what's not on the slide, and something we didn't include in this CARD study, but we were working on it at the time, is issues pertaining to characters with disabilities. Now, Danny Woodburn's here. I saw him come in, and he will be talking at length about this, and he can speak to disability on television as well, because he's just completed an investigation with the Ruderman Family Foundation. But I do want to talk just for briefly a second on characters with disability in film. Although we didn't measure it here, we did measure this in our latest Top 100 film study from 2015. Out of 4,370 speaking characters, only 2.4% were characters with a disability. And only 19% of those characters with a disability were females. This is a new low for gender inequality. 19%. Remember, the population norm is 50, in case anyone forgot. Now, turning to lead characters, the focus on all speaking characters is really about the landscape, but we also take a look at the leads or co-leads. So we're really trying to answer the question here, who drives the action in stories across media platforms? And as you can see, just focusing on gender, we take a deeper dive in the report. In other identity groups, only 26.5% of all leads or co-leads were female in the films that we evaluated coming out of these top studios. And 42%, which is quite good actually, of all series regulars in television and streaming content and on the broadcast networks, 42% of series regulars were girls and women. And I think there might be another component to this slide. Nope, I guess I was wrong. Okay, so once we turn from just sheer amount, and people a lot of times make the case that sheer amount's not important. I would argue quite differently. Sheer amount is very important, but the context or the way in which characters are shown is equally, if not more, important. And so we take a look at a couple of different ways in which characters might be shown on screen. In terms of gender roles, we're really interested in the perpetuation of domesticity. Are characters shown as parents? And what's interesting here is that 41% of all characters that could be evaluated on this measure, there was enough information, 41% were parents or caregivers. And in film is the only place where we continue to see the problem of females being shown in this role as a parent more than their male counterparts. Okay? We see more females in domesticated roles than we do their male counterparts. No differences on the other platforms in terms of caregiving. We also looked at how many characters were shown in committed romantic relationships. About half of the ones that could be evaluated on this measure. Interestingly enough, again, it's only film that's domesticating women, not men, which we know can not only perpetuate gender stereotyping, but it restricts the range of possibilities of what women can do on screen if they're just trapped at home. In addition to domesticity, another politicized area on screen is age. And I know with recently, with activism and legislation around this issue, there's been a big push, a successful push to get the age of actors taken off screen. I know Ellen's here from SAG. She can probably speak to their amazing efforts in this arena. So we wanted to look at age, like we do quite a bit in our studies, and whether age is gendered. And for every character, we can put them into a series of different demarcations between 0 to into infinity when you're dealing with animation. But when we look at children and teens on screen, and this is really important for activism, about 41% of all characters that were between 0 and 20 were female. Now you might think, well, why is that a big deal? Particularly when fully half of all girls in young women in this category, fully half of these characters were female. This tells us that when screenwriters are projecting younger characters onto the screen, small or large, this isn't where bias is happening as much. Okay? When they're writing for younger roles, we see more equality on screen. I think this is really important for those people that are trying to tackle implicit bias. When you're writing schools, when you're writing families, when you're writing places where kids occur, it doesn't seem to be as unequal as when characters get older. So let's bring in the next slide. When we move to characters 40 and above, the percentage of females drops significantly. And this is really important. In film, it goes down to 21% of all characters are women, right? Which means we're seeing a great deal of older men on screen. This is probably where implicit bias is happening. People are writing occupations, they're ideating on the roles that characters can fill. If the script says police officer, firefighter, doctor, men are probably projected into that role. So this is something that really tips us off to where biases might begin or be perpetuated in screenwriting and casting. Okay, so we look at domesticity, we look at age. We also are interested in the sexualization of characters on screen. For years, we've been looking at the percentage of characters in sexualized attire, shown partially or fully naked, and those that are referenced as physically attractive. And I don't need to tell this crowd that there are pronounced gender differences when it comes to the sexualization of girls and women on screen. Here we see that females are about 5 times as likely to be shown in sexy attire than males. They're 3 times as likely to be shown naked or partially naked and referenced as attractive. Now, I don't have the measures here, but we also look at how females are shown in animation. And sometimes animation females are so thin that their waist size approximates their upper arm, leaving no room for a womb or any other internal organ. So, you might ask, why is it important to study this? Well, we know from research that exposure to objectifying content can contribute to and reinforce body shame, appearance anxiety, and self-objectification among some females. So it becomes important to put these things together. Sexualization by age. What are young people seeing when it comes to younger girls and women on screen? So we took the sample of all the characters and divided it into 3 categories: teens, young adults, and middle-aged females. So 13 to 20-year-olds, 21 to 39-year-olds, and then 40 to 64-year-olds. And we reran the previous analysis. And what the results on the screen are going to show you is that female teens are just as likely to be sexualized as 21 to 39-year-olds. And they're just as likely to be shown with some nudity as 21 to 39-year-olds. We won't discuss here anything about middle-aged women. You can project it and see it on the screen. Now, do all platforms equally sexualize younger females? The answer is no. Cable and streaming content are the worst offenders. Now, why is this important? Because in film, the number of females has not increased in decades. And the big problem with simply saying add more female characters without a consideration of the way in which they're depicted, we might actually, with activism, increase the presence of females on screen while at the same time contributing to harmful effects amongst the audience. So thinking about prevalence and context is extraordinarily important because television has made gains, but these can also come with the consequence. Okay, so that was focusing on screen. Let's turn to behind the camera quickly. We were interested in answering a couple of questions about inclusivity and hiring practices behind the camera. So here we didn't only look at the initial story or the initial episode, we looked at every episode, directors and writers across television as well as film. And when we turn to what we found, across over 4,000 directors across the 414 stories evaluated, only 15.2% were female. This is a ratio of 5.6 to 1. However, platform was related to director gender. Broadcast seems to be doing slightly better than cable and streaming, but film, again, is coming in way behind. Matter of fact, the ratio is 28.4 2.5 male directors to every 1 female director. Now, the other 3 areas, particularly streaming, this is behind when we think about kind of the norms that the DGA report. We also know that worldwide, according to another study that we've done, worldwide, 28% of all short film directors, narrative short film directors, are women. So these are well below what we see when it comes to worldwide standards. Now, we also looked at underrepresented directors of the first episode of all the television shows in our sample, as well as for the films. 13% were underrepresented directors. Again, an under-indexing in terms of proportionality. But what's even more problematic is there were only 2 underrepresented female directors accounted for across the films and across all of the television shows. Only 2 black women got the opportunity to direct. When we turn to writers, we also see that they're we looked at over 6,000 writers. We also see that the writer's room, again, no surprise to this room, pulls extraordinarily male. Less than 30% of all the writers evaluated were female. This is a gender ratio of 2.5 males to every 1 female. It also varied by platform. Writers seem to be getting the most opportunity in the broadcast networks. Film, of course, is the worst offender, bringing up the rear with 8.3 male writers to every 1 female writer. Now, we were interested in the relationship between who you have in the writer's room and who you are directing and what you see on screen. We also looked at if you have a female showrunner, how does this affect the patterns that we see in storytelling? And sure enough, having a female director, writer, or showrunner dramatically increases the percentage of females on screen. We saw the exact same pattern when it comes to having an underrepresented director behind the camera, increasing the proportion of underrepresented characters on screen. Now, a lot of times our work stops here, but for the card analysis, we were interested in 2 additional things that I'll just spend a few moments talking about. Since we were looking at 9 companies plus the CW, we were able to really get a sense of not only their storytelling, but who they were hiring behind the camera. So we wanted to ask now, in this next set of questions, who's calling the shots at the SVP, so the Senior Vice President, EVP, and CEO or C-suite level. So our goal here was really to understand who's hiring and considering individuals across the pipeline of employees within an entertainment company. So here, focusing on the companies that we evaluated, we could only obtain the data, the reliable data, on gender for C-suite, board of directors, and executive management teams of the companies. Now, we had to look at executive management teams because sometimes there are more divisions to these companies than just entertainment, and these teams enabled us to focus on who are in positions of power as it pertains to entertainment. So what did we find across these companies? Again, no big surprise, only 19% of all of the boardroom are female. 21% of CEOs, COOs, CFOs, etc. are female, and 19% of the executive management team. We barely break a fifth. Okay, so if we're thinking about a pipeline problem, the upper echelons of power are a bit better than what we see with directors, but not too terribly much. We drilled down to see how these things might vary by platform, and the research actually becomes pretty interesting. We wanted to take a look in television, streaming, and film, how females are doing at these different levels. I think that if you take a look here, on my far left, your right, we're going to see an all too familiar pattern. As power increases, female participation decreases, or as the prestige moves up, females are pushed out. TV is at near parity in 2 of the 3 divisions examined. which may partially account for some of the increases we see with female characters on screen, but film and streaming are still largely exclusionary of women at the EVP level and above. So if we take a step back at this point, the medium that's really standing out as a problem is film. And if we were to take a look at characters in film and put them against population norms, the three most underserved, based on data, groups in film are girls and women first, characters with disabilities second, and Latinos third, in terms of how far off film is from what we see on screen and what exists in terms of population norms in the United States. The last thing that we did with CARD is we decided to grade or evaluate the companies. And we really were interested in how are companies doing across a whole series of inclusion indicators. Not just on screen, not just leads, not just directors, not just writers, but if we put them all together, how are these companies performing across film and their television divisions? So that's exactly what we did. We created a series of metrics for on-screen and behind the camera for film, television, and streaming companies. We had a couple of indicators that looked at gender and a few that looked at race and ethnicity. What we did is we took the indicators, added them up, and divided by the total number of measures investigated. Then we compared that average to what you would find in the real world. So for example, in the real world, you have 50% of everyone in the population is a girl or a woman. So on screen, we can evaluate against leads and all speaking characters, how is the industry doing on gender, vis-a-vis that 50% point statistic. So that's exactly what we did. So if we bring in, I just went through some of these indicators already, but that's what we did with gender, race, ethnicity, and LGBT on screen. LGBT was only for film. Since we only looked at the first story in television, we didn't want to penalize the industry if they introduced an LGBT character beyond that first episode. And behind the camera, we looked at directors, and we compared it to the worldwide statistic that we found with short films. For writers and show creators, we used the standard that emerged from our data. So what we then did, and I don't have to spend a lot of time because I think you all know the metrics of grading, we compared each of these indicators, how far off they were from our metric with a standard academic scale, with 90 being an A, or fully inclusive, all the way down to a fail, or what we wanted to say more softly, not inclusive. 59% or lower off of the norm, okay? So let's see how the companies did in terms of grading. The higher to 100, the perfect score. 90's an A, 80's a B, 70's a C. You know how this goes, and there was no curving in this exercise, as my students like to ask all the time. Are you going to curve it? Not this time. Okay, so let's look at film. And if you look on your far right, we have the companies on your far left, their scores on your far right. Our overachievers get 100%, which would be a perfect inclusion score across who's on screen, gender, speaking characters and leads, race, ethnicity, same capacity, LGBT presence, directors, writers, etc. Sum them up on the far right-hand side. Every single company failed on inclusion. Every single company failed. This is the first time we've done this, but my sneaking suspicion is if 17 films last year didn't have one African-American speaking character on screen, and the year before 17 films didn't have one African-American speaking character on screen, and the year before the same finding, I would imagine that these are relatively stable indicators of how film has been doing regarding inclusion over time. Now, when we turned to television and streaming outlets, there was much more variability. Interestingly, when we bring in the top slide, you can read it in the same capacity. On your far right is the total score. On your far left is the company. What we see here, we have two companies that happen to be the top performers across all the television and streaming content evaluated. There's another card coming on the next slide. But the two top performers are the CW and the Walt Disney Company. Largely inclusive on screen of gender. Walt Disney is largely inclusive when it comes to race and ethnicity, largely inclusive when it comes to showrunners, and fully or largely inclusive when it comes to writers. But their score is still a C, 70%. And so just as we move forward in the conversations about framing the day, I think we have to be relatively sober of when we're thinking about advances towards inclusion, we're not talking about the top of the game here. We're still talking about companies receiving an average score as the top performer. Now, if we turn to the next slide, we'll see the last set of companies, where we see the next set of companies coming in right under 70%. Both Hulu and Amazon on the streaming platforms, which are new, potentially exciting models for inclusion, scored 65%. Okay? But again, if I was giving a student a 65% on an exam, that would be a D. So I think that this card evaluation, for the first time, and we've received great feedback from many of the companies that are up on this screen, it provided a way to standardize and give the industry feedback on how they're performing on screen, behind the camera, on the metrics that we evaluated. Film still has a very long way to go. Now, I'm just about out of time. And typically, with a presentation like this, I'd spend a good 10 minutes talking about the solutions to inequality on screen. But I'm not going to do that today. I will bring in all of the ways in which I think we can start to address some of these complex problems with straightforward and targeted solutions. Whether it's targeting inclusion goals, we might want to go back one. Whether it's recognizing and altering stereotypical thinking, whether it's giving companies checks and balances to deal with the way in which they may make decisions to counter implicit, but more importantly, explicit biases in the hiring process, and finally, really relying on sophisticated economic analyses to make decisions about what sells. I'm not going to take you through all of the ways in which I think the industry can change. And the reason why I'm not going to do that is because we have so many amazing panelists that have flown in from different places in the country. They've come from places here in Los Angeles, showrunners, producers, activists, members of the guilds. They're going to talk about what they're doing in terms of boots on the ground to try to change the inclusion crisis that's facing Hollywood. I think the data are clear. The US media still depict a very skewed version of our world. Decisions and decision makers do not have to be impervious to change. Solutions exist. We will hear about them today, and this isn't a problem that only faces Hollywood. At the end of the day, the whole goal is to put tools into the hands of storytellers so that their imaginations won't be as limited as what we have just seen on screen. Thank you.
If you want to take a question or two.
I might have time for 2 questions if anyone has them. Yes. Hi.
How did the industry react to the card? Did you see any pragmatic, concrete example of, like, of course, many of them were extremely scared about it? For them to go to the microphone?
No, it's nice if we're recording.
Okay. How was it?
Yes, we want you to the mic. Yes. You're our first question of the day. So.
Okay, so first, congratulations. It's amazing, the card report, but what was the reaction, like the follow-up, the pragmatic, concrete actions that all those companies and their executives took? Because I think I remember being here when you first launched it and just like,
Sure.
I could see many people scared the following week. And what happened after that?
A lot of conversations and a lot of acceleration, I think, of conversation of action that was already taking place. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. We know that the Sundance Institute and Women in Film have launched probably one of the largest organizational efforts to create change, right? I think that these data threw gas on the fire, right? We've received calls from different companies. Can you come in and talk with us about some of your solutions? So it's hard to answer that question because anyone that I think thinks that certain aspects of these slides will change instantly is crazy, right? In terms of behind the camera, that is going to take some time. There, I think, are solutions to accelerate that process, but we've got some issues in terms of hiring consideration lists, ensuring that people who have the talent and expertise are given the opportunity to be able to do that. On screen, I think some changes can be made really quickly. Interestingly enough, I think a lot of the focus has been on implicit bias, and a lot of the industry's problems are explicit bias as well. And so I think that this starts to help that conversation get concretized and create action items to facilitate change. So for what I can talk about, because there are certain things I can't talk about, obviously, there's a quickening. And how do we get there faster? And what things can be implemented strategically now versus what is going to take a few years to roll out. And I apologize for having to be so vague in the answer, and hopefully I'll be able to talk a little bit more publicly, about some of those solutions in the months to come. Sure. Maybe time for one more. Yeah.
Did you do any studies in terms of representation in film school? I'm currently attending film school. I'm one of 3 women that was accepted 3 terms ago at Art Center. Not sure how many people were accepted here at USC and how many of them were women of color, women over the age of 25. So when I'm in my screenwriting courses or other courses, it becomes quite apparent that the stories that are going to be continued to be told are the same stories that are being told right now, because there isn't that many of us in film school, and there isn't that much support for the women that are currently in film school.
Right.
So in terms of studies and in terms of follow-up and in terms of next steps, what did you do? What are your next steps, and where do you see this going?
That's a great question, and one I so welcome to answer. So I think there's a really interesting thing going on right now in talking about pipeline. And so I'm going to answer part of your question first, and then I want to back up. So we're in negotiations with a particular group to underwrite doing this investigation, the one you just laid out. So sometimes these negotiations take a long time, and we're busy with other projects, so we have to fit it into, the bandwidth of what we can do. But I think it needs to be done for a couple of reasons. One is you hear all the time people talking, well, 50% of film schools are filled with women. And I would say, okay, well, that might be the case, but film schools feature more than just production. They feature other aspects that might be very attractive to female students, like critical or cultural studies. So I've never seen a study that pulls out and says what percentage of production majors are women. That's what needs to be done. And of those women, how many are women of color, right? How many are women with disabilities, which I think is incredibly important, because only 2.4% of all characters, this isn't even in the imagination of screenwriters when Speechless is revolutionary, right, on television this fall. So I think you're exactly right. We've done a lot of research with Sundance and Women on Film on the impediments that face women directors. And I think we need to take a step back and say, what's happening in film school, and are women being pushed to documentary, or are they being pushed to producing if they want to direct or if they want to right. The second thing is there's some exciting research coming out of Stanford. And it started in Stanford, and now it's, I think, moved, the researcher who's been working on it, it's now up in Washington, on a concept called ambient belonging. And what we know from some of the research in this arena is that females' interest in computer science decreases in the classroom and in the university context because of the ambient or environmental cues communicate to them that they're not a part of that culture. Right? The stereotypical nature that might correlate with computer science. My question is the same thing happening in film school? Females might come in very excited, but what are the cues? What's being taught in the classroom? Are we teaching the history of female directors over the last 100 years? What directors and writers of color are being talked about in the classroom? Who are the instructors? What are the pictures on the wall? What is being communicated to our students about this is a fit for them? And then how, generationally, are families and communities embracing underrepresented racial and ethnic groups for participating in film when they don't see themselves reflected in those stories. So it's something we've had a passionate about and we've wanted to do for years, and for us it's always a function of funding. If the money's there, we'll do the investigation. And so we're hoping in 2017 that we can get all the kinks worked out on this, and that will be one of our major signature studies for next year. Thank you. So thank you. I think we're out of time, so I want to turn it back to Henry.